Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm trying to influence youth today, young teenagers, mature teenagers, young adults, mature adults, and OAPs. But firstly, I want to admit a massive, huge mistake I did earlier. I started studying my second module book. Well, at least I thought it was my second module book. I started reading my second module book from last year by accident. Absolute massive mistake. And I totally apologise if you're listening. I'm trying to influence, youth today, trying to be an appropriate, mature adult. But when times move on and you've finished one module, you can move on to the next one without even giving it a thought. But make sure you reference your reading and make sure you're reading the right materials. I pulled out my old module book. We're on the module DD 211, Understanding Politics, Ideas and Institutions in a Modern World. Make sure you reference your reading. Understanding Politics, Ideas and Institutions in the Modern World, Book 2, is edited by Richard Heffernan, Simon Underwood, and Edward Westmisnter. The book is published at the Open University, Walton Hall, Milton Keynes. First published 2015, the second edition is 2022. Anyway, we're on the introduction. So that gives you the tutor know where you're starting from. You need to know your starting points. First, run the introduction, page 5. This chapter explores the ways in which the UK parliamentary system and unitary state differs from the US presidential system and federal state. It compares and contrasts the UK's fluid, flexible constitution with the fixed, inflexible constitution of the US, and it then explores the political impacts of these very different systems and states. The difference between these two examples of liberal democratic system and states arises because parliamentary and presidential, unitary and federal systems reflect distinct constitutional arrangements. Each system therefore throws up very different institutions. The executive, the elected government, and the recommends and implements rules is headed by the Prime Minister in the UK and the President in the US. The legislature or representative assembly in the UK is Parliament, comprising the House of Lords and House of Commons, which is very different from the US Congress, comprising the House representatives and the Senate. Both the Lords and the Commons, the House of the Senate, make the rules by enacting laws. The US judiciary, unlike the UK judiciary, which enforces the rule of UK Parliament, it is the ultimate legal authority and can enforce constitutional rules that determine what the executive and the legislator can and cannot do. This chapter thus explores how the UK parliamentary and unitary system and state provides for a different form of government from that US presidential and federal system and state. Comparing the political systems of the UK and US. Within a parliamentary system like that in the UK, the chief executive power must be supported by a majority in its legislature and can fall if it receives a vote of no confidence. Executive power, normally in conjunction with the head of the state, has the capacity to dissolve the legislature and call for elections. Stephen and Skatch, 1994, page 120. Under a presidential system such as the US, however, the legislative power has a fixed electoral mandate. That is its own source of legitimacy. And the chief executive power has a fixed electoral mandate. That is its own source of legitimacy. Sartoria, 1996, page 84. In the UK's parliamentary system, the Prime Minister is not elected by the people. He or she heads the government by being a party leader, who he or she heads the government by being a party leader who emerges from within the legislature by virtue of his or her party. Commanding a majority of the seats in the House of Commons, or should there be any party majority, by forming a coalition. By contrast, the US President popularly enjoys a national constituency, a fixed term of office, and electoral and political independence from the legislator. Foley 2000, page 11. A system is presidential only if the head of state, the president, results from popular election during his or her pre-established tenure. It cannot be discharged by a parliamentary vote, and heads or otherwise directs the governments that he or she appoints. When these conditions are joint met, then doubtlessly we have a pure presidential system. This is the case of in the US, where the president is directly elected. Parliamentary system require the fusion of the executive and the legislative. Presidential system require their strict separation. The UK thus has a parliamentary system which fuses the executive, the government, and the legislative parliament, and provides for executive leadership of the legislator, and for the legislator predominance over the judiciary. UK politics are primarily conducted between the executive and the legislative branches against the ever present important backdrop of the public opinion and electoral outcomes. The executive, headed by the Prime Minister, is not elected by the people, rather, it emerges from the elected part of Parliament, the House of Commons. By having the support of a majority of MPs, the UK's judicial branch is formally non political, even if judges have their own personal political preference. Its role is largely confined to implementing whatever legislation is passed by Parliament, but the judiciary can interpret the meaning of parliamentary law when it is vague or where one law conflicts with other laws. The power of judicial review in the UK enables judges to interpret the expressed or implied intent of Parliament. Where it is unclear or contradictory, judges can decide whether ministers exceed the powers granted them by Parliament. They do not, however, make the changed law. While providing legislative predominance over the judiciary, the UK of the democracy facilitates executive dominance over the legislature, provided the executive has a parliamentary majority and gives the legislature ultimate authority over the judiciary. Purely unitary states explored below place final power and at the centre, even if formal and informal political demands require the centre to respect some degree of local autonomy. The US has a presidential federal system. Federal systems separate power within the central government and between this central government and local states. In the case of the US, there are 50 states of the Union. The US central government is based on separated, shared powers between the executive, the presidency, and the legislature Congress. Each institution is separately constituted by different arrangements. The head of the US executive, the president, is directly elected by the people, and there are separate elections for the two different houses of the Congress, the House of the Representatives and the Senate. The executive and the legislature are therefore separate, not fused. No individual can simultaneously be a member of more than one branch, thus to become president in 2019, once he had been elected. Barack Obama had to resign as a senator of the Senate of Illinois. By contrast, I don't know how to pronounce that, by the way, you Americans listening, David Cameron, like all prime ministers, could only become prime minister in 2010 by becoming a member of the House of Commons. The separation of powers between the executive and the legislature means the US president cannot be a member of the US Congress. But the fusion of the executive and legislature means that the prime minister must, by convention, be a member of the House of Commons. Each of the three branches of the US government is granted distinctive and different governmental functions, simplifying a little. We can say that US executive is responsible for the rule proposal and implementation, the legislature for the ruling making, and the judiciary for rule adjudication. Page 8. How do UK and US political systems differ? The star and stripes of the US federal state. United States and the Union flag of the UK unitary state. The US has a limited government that is governed by an inflexible constitution, laws passed by President and Congress, and by the state governments are subject to judicial review. The constitutionality It's determined by federal courts and a constitutional court. The Supreme Court, the judiciary, has the power to strike down legislation or public actions that are not provided for in the US Constitution. It is appointed by the President with the agreement of the Senate. Judges can serve for life and cannot be removed for political reasons. They are wholly autonomous of all other executive and legislative actors. Only when a judge willingly vacates the bench can their replacement be nominated. Thus, compared with the UK, the US has a much more decentralised political entity. The UK's parliamentary system operates within a unitary state and under a fluid, easily changeable constitution, but the US presidential system is located within a federal state and under a fixed constitution. This is very different to change. These are two fundamental differences between the UK and the US political systems. Page 9. These differences reflect the peculiar histories of the two nations and their very different political cultures. Put at its crudest, the US places far less trust in its state and government compared to the UK. As a result, the US political system reflects the country's preparedness to place significant restrictions on its government and its eagerness to limit the power of the state. The UK political system empowers its government by being willing to expand the power of the state. This has the following implications. The key institutional differences between the UK and the US: the UK parliamentary state fuses executive and legislature, and while the judiciary is able to interpret the intention of the legislator when its law is unclear or contradictory, the judiciary is subordinate to both. The US presidential state strictly separates powers between its executive, legislature, and judiciary. The UK utility state has traditionally centralised power within a central trade state run by government, and the state can delegate power should it choose, which has done in regard to the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, and Northern Ireland Assembly. The US federal state separates power vertically between the federal government and each of the 50 states that comprise the US with the federal system. The UK Constitution empowers the state to determine which powers citizens have and when they are valid. The US Constitution provides citizens with unalienable rights with which the state and the government cannot interfere. Broadly speaking, the US political system seeks to prevent possibly of the abuse of state power by frustrating its use. It does this by separating powers horizontally within the institutions of all federal presidential system and vertically between the federal government and the states. By contrast, the UK political system historically enables the use of state power by investing it in within parliamentary system. Inside a unitary state, centralisation has been the name of political game in the UK. Decentralisation is the ballpark theme in the US, except for occasions of national emergency and issues of national security, defence and foreign policy. As a result, the US has a limited government, while the UK has an unlimited government. We're going to finish up there. I'm just going to do a few pages. We can get back to the reading tomorrow. How are we, San Diego?